Hello there, and welcome to this new episode of this short series about building a RESTful API with Symfony 5. In the previous episodes, we set up an environment for our application using Docker. We wrote the controller for our first endpoint, and we dealt with the repository, which will provide us the data from data source, which at this point is a simple JSON file on our file system. In this episode, we're gonna be dealing with the validation of query parameters passed through the URL, of course, to our system. Let's start from the simplest thing. Well, not the simplest would be probably the shout, but I was thinking about this validation, and we will probably use a validator. So what I was thinking is the limit of quotes retrieved by the provider. I don't think that validation should be in here, because this object could be used somewhere else, right? And maybe that something else is not gonna have the same validation. So I would move the validation up, and I would move it in the controller probably. So to do so, what we're gonna do is we have a look at our controller, our endpoint, and here we could simply say if limit less than 1 or limit greater than 10, give us some return a different response with an error which says, I don't know, invalid argument, limit should be between 1 and 10 or something like that. But this way we are injecting some logic into this controller that shouldn't have any logic. And to do that, instead we could use an external validator. We could pass it through the constructor as we did now and do this thing in that validator. And again, this validator could be some sort of interface and change the validators and so on. What we're gonna do though, we're gonna use something very nice, which is something available in Symfony with their validation component. It's a collection constraint. This way, we will just pass to that validator all of our parameters. So tomorrow we want to add something, maybe an offset, maybe, I don't know, whatever. We can pass it to that validator, which will then define a collection constraint and validate all of the parameters in one place, which sounds nice. So let's see how to do that. First of all, we're gonna need, let's call it, actually, we need to go through the test first, right? And what we're gonna do is we open our controller test and we say what? We have this one. Let's copy this test and let's say it fails with invalid parameters. And so we create our client, we call our correct route, we'll go there, and we want to pass some parameter as well, right? The way to do that is, there you go. So we have method, we have URI, and then an array of parameters. So after our URI, we have our parameters, and we pass limit 11. Which is more than what we're gonna define as a constraint. As per requirement, we want our limit to be between 1 and 10. And we're gonna search for the moment that we get a 400 response code. If we run this test now, it's gonna fail because we will probably get, too few arguments. Local JSON quotes provider, 0 path. Where are we? Where is this failing? This is failing in our endpoints, line 40. So yeah, what's happening is in our services we're not passing our parameter, and until now this test didn't fail because we were asserting the 404, so it would break before instantiating the local JSON quote provider, which is the one missing the parameter. And this one was actually succeeding because we were simply mocking the result and getting it back from here. Instead, on the provider test, we were creating it by instantiating it manually without using the dependency injection, and so we didn't spot this error before. What we could do, we could actually use dependency injection here. Let's see, maybe later we can change this. Yeah, so what's happening now, this error here, it's because actually hits the endpoint, and the endpoint starts elaborating, and the endpoint controller has this dependency. And this dependency is created by our dependency injection container, and when it goes and try and create it, it doesn't pass any argument to it. And this is a problem because our constructor expects a data file, a string with a path, and we're not passing it, so it fails. What we're gonna do is, let's create a parameter, right? So we create a parameter, we call it local JSON data file, and now we need to understand how to point to the correct directory. So this file is here, so we should probably double dot and get into data. So let's see if that works. Double dot and get into data, and we have quotes dot JSON. The same thing though, we should do it for the test probably. And yeah, I suppose we still get the error because here we don't have the parameter. So we have the parameter here. Let's add it as an argument here for the moment. It's a service, and we're gonna have an argument type string probably, and this argument is gonna be, I think you refer to parameters with this notation, and it's gonna be this one. So we define the data file and we're passing it. All right, we define the service, we define the parameter, and we're passing the parameter to the service. And our test, I suppose, will still fail because we didn't do the same for the test environment. We have an internal error actually, and it seems it doesn't manage to read our file. So is it even overwritten? Let's try and put this parameter here. So services, before services we have our parameters, and we have our service like this, and we have our argument, and let's remove it instead from here. So we comment out this one, and we comment out this bit here. So we have it in the test, but we don't have it in the production. And if we run the test again, what does it say? Is it complain about the missing while child element argument defined service argument? So it probably doesn't expect. Oh, because this is an alias, right? Oh, that's it. I see what's going on here. This is an alias, so we can't pass the argument. What we need to do is we leave this one alone, and we need to overwrite that local JSON data file. Because we are defining it in here, we are passing it to the production. Production here is an alias of this one, so it's exactly the same thing. How can we override that parameter now? Thus overwriting it like this. No, this file doesn't exist, but it's just to test it. Can we even see what's going on? Yeah, so he actually tries to load quotes too. So we define quotes, and then we override quotes too in the test environment. So even if this is an alias, when this is loaded, the parameter will be overwritten, and so this new service, which is an alias of this one, will actually have this parameter as an argument instead of the one defined in the live services, production services. Now we need to understand why our path is not working, and I think I'm gonna do some tests offline, and I'm gonna get back to you guys. And I'm back. So I did a bit of research, and instead of getting crazy with relative paths, I found out that Symfony provides you this nice parameter. It's computed in the kernel, or maybe in the base kernel. Anyway, somewhere at the bootstrap of your application, this parameter is computed, and by default it points to the directory where the composer JSON is. So it's the very root of the project. So you can do either these /bin. In our case here we have these parameters / so this is just a string, right? So we kind of concatenate it with /data and quotes, and here we are overwriting it with tests. So we are on the root, so we get into tests fixtures quotes JSON, and then I went to run our test, and as we were expecting before all this mess with the paths, the test is failing because we assert an error 400 bed requests, and we get instead a 200 because there's no constraint on the limit yet. So this actually works. We need to make it fail now and return a 400. To do that, we are going to introduce a new class in here, a new dependency for this constructor of our controller, which we're gonna call request parameters validator, and let's call it parameters validator. Maybe we initialize our properties. PHP Storm is complaining because he doesn't know what we're talking about, right? He can't import this class because we actually need to create it. So to create that class, what we're gonna do, as usual, we're gonna create our test first. So new folder, validators. Inside that folder, new PHP class, request, blah blah blah, test. Alright, we have it. We make it extend a test case, and we say public function, and we say has blah 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 class, and here we say $validator equals new blah blah blah, and then we say this assert instance of blah 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 class. And doesn't work, of course, because we don't have it, right? So we need to create this class. To create this class, we'll go in our source folder, we say new folder, validators, keeping namespaces the same, create a class, and we say nothing for the moment. We go to our tests, we import our class, expected, actual, it's our validator. Right, and now if we run this test, it should pass because we have that class. Now that we have that class, we will have to add some functionality probably to this, but for the moment we go here and we say import class. We have our parameter validator. Now that we have that, probably the tests on our controller will start failing because our dependency injection is wrong. Too few arguments, our controller expects 2 parameters, we pass just 1. So we have to go to our services and we need to define our validator. So let's get this one here, put it here. We're gonna get this here as no argument, up validators, and our ID is up validators. That's why I love Symfony and the extension for PHP Storm. And here we say Ctrl D, we add the new up validators, right? And we need to do the same here, right? Because we are overriding it. I wonder at this point if I could avoid overwriting the whole thing, you know, and as we did for the parameter for this alias, change this parameter. I'll think about it off camera, and maybe I'll get back to you on this point. But now we have our parameters, and if we run our controllers test, just the last one should fail, saying that 200 won't match 400, but here our controller managed to be constructed, so we are okay. And so we have this test failing where we assert we expect 400, and we can start working on it by saying that we want try and catch. We will catch an exception and return a different response in that case. So what we're gonna try is this parameters validator validate limit. So we're asking our parameters validator to validate this limit, and probably if anything goes wrong, we're gonna throw an invalid parameter exception. But we don't want to throw the Symfony one. We're gonna create our own exception, and we're gonna say return new JSON response with some message, probably gonna be get message and a status of response bad request. Here it is. So we will have a bad request back if this validation throws an exception, and that's what we need to do next. Go to our validator, make it throw an exception in that case. We probably need to test this method first, right? And then write it. We're gonna go to the test for our validator and we're gonna say it throws exception for invalid parameters. Right, so we have our validator and we say that this expects exception, and we want an exception string which is gonna be, what did we say, throws invalid parameter exception class, and this will happen when we call validator validate limit. Actually, let's make it an array, because we want to use it, as we said before, for more than one parameter in case we add more. So here the same thing, validate 11, because we know our constraint says between 1 and 10, and these of course will fail because we don't have this method, because we don't know what this exception is. I was thinking though to make it dynamic, and by that I mean results limit, max results limit, which is gonna be 10. Now we need to call this. This is what I can use, a web test case, even though it's not really a web test case, but this gives me the possibility to use the container from boot kernel, get container, get parameter, if I remove the function parentheses, get parameter, and the parameter we want is this one, max result limit, and this one we pass it here. So we have that now, and this value we will use it actually in our validator as well. Now to make this test pass we need this exception, which we don't know what it is yet, so source new folder exceptions, and we're gonna say new PHP class we say extends invalid parameter exception from Symfony, and yeah, this is ours, and we don't want a previous probably, and we say parent construct with our message and our code. So we can now throw our exception with a mess, right? But at the moment it just expects it. So let's import this class, and it's our class. And we need the validate method, which we can now write. Oh, this is our public function validate, which accepts an array of parameters. Still, running this test will fail because it doesn't throw an exception yet. If we say throw new invalid parameter exception blah blah blah, our test will pass. Still, we know that our test is written properly. Here we expect this thing to happen, so we want to test it with max limit +1. We want it greater than max limit. And then we will check that when the limit we pass is smaller than max limit or equal to max limit, the validator doesn't throw the exception. Actually, to do that, as our validator will just do its thing and throw an exception if there is an invalid parameter between those passed, and if the exception doesn't happen, it will do nothing and the catch is skipped, and we will get the stuff from the provider and return our response. So does nothing means that there's no return value, and in PHP when a function doesn't return any value, it returns null, and that's what we can test. So we can copy this one and say no exception is thrown for valid parameters, and in this case we just say validate max limit. Actually we can directly say these assert null, and the result of this. Let's run this. Oh, but now it's throwing the exception. Sorry, so the exception is not thrown, and yeah, it's okay, it works, so that's okay. So we can now implement the actual validate, and to do that we're gonna need to use Symfony Validator component, which we're gonna require through Composer as usual. And it's done. Now we can define our constraints, right? And we're gonna use a new constraint. So the constraint is actually collection, which is from the validator constraints. What I wanted to do though, this is not a collection, you know, it might be confusing like this. It's a validation constraint collection. So what I'm gonna do, I wanted to do like this as assert, and now I can say new assert collection, and this makes much more sense. So I'm asserting the constraint has to be a collection. They use assert because actually in Symfony and Doctrine you have annotations to simplify things, and when you annotate a Doctrine entity or doctrine entity, you just say add assert and it creates a constraint for the property. So it's sort of a standard, let's say, and we're doing the same here. This is how actually you validate not entities but raw values like scalar, integers, you know, types and arrays. So we have our collection, and this collection is actually defined by adding all the values we want to validate, or actually all the named constraints for the values. So then when we say this validator validate the parameter, the value, and we have to pass a constraint, and it's gonna be the key in these objects. So we need actually an array like this, and so here our first object is gonna be limit, and constraint on our limit, it's gonna be the range. So we can use this again, the same alias assert range, and we are constructing this constraint. So new assert range, and this wants an array as well, and we need to pass the maximum and the minimum values. So we say the minimum is 1 and the maximum is, let's say, 10, and then we're gonna use our parameter. So this is one of the constraints of limit, and if it's just one, it's okay like this, but we're gonna actually define a new one to force the value being an integer. So we're gonna say new assert divisible by 0.5, and this is it. This is our validator for the moment. And to use it, we will actually say we need to create a validator, and we can use this factory, and then we can say violations equals validator validate, and here our parameters come into play. So we want to validate parameters. We know we have a limit, and for this one we want to use the limit constraint in our collection we defined before. So this is going to be an array, of course, that's why I had that closing bracket there, and we want to pass the constraint, which is our collection. So what we're saying here is validator, please validate my parameter called limit, and use the limit constraint defined in this collection of constraints, and this should work. This validate method from the validator will return a validations object, and this validations object will have something like violations object will have something like errors, get errors, something like that. Or no, actually we have this is already the collection of errors, so we can count, and we can say if 0 is different from our validation count, so we have errors. If we have a violation, we can throw our exception, and I was thinking at the moment we have just one parameter, so our message can simply be invalid limit 1 to 10. And the other thing we can do is we want to get this from our parameter bag, And we need our container actually, so we can do a public function construct where we pass in our container from Symfony, and as usual we can initialize the properties, so we have our private property, and now we can say this container get parameter, and our parameter it's called like this. So now we have it. Now something will break for sure because we introduced this new thing. I think this is a good point to run all the tests. And here we have our errors. Quite some stuff broke. So 0 passed in our endpoint. Yeah, because this is getting it from the dependency injection, and in dependency injection we didn't pass. Yeah, it has 0. So we can actually inject it into it. And actually, instead of doing that, what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna inject straight away that max limit. So instead of passing the container, I'm gonna pass an integer called max results limit. So we're gonna throw away this, we're gonna throw away this, and we're gonna initialize this property instead. Now we have it, and instead of container, we're gonna get this max results limit. And what we're gonna do, we're gonna inject it in here with an argument of type string probably, right? Yeah, there's no integer, let's use string, and this argument is gonna be this parameter. So we don't need to pass the container and get this value, we pass directly the value in. So we have the parameter now, we have it injected in here, and let's run all the tests again. Undefined index limit in the validator, line 35. What error did we do? Parameters limit. Right, because this is because, so now limit will always be set unless it's null. So I guess we can say unless we don't pass it as a parameter when we call the function, when we call the endpoint, then we have a default to 1. So we can simply say if limit, so if it exists, it's not null, call this try, otherwise do your thing because there's no limit. So let's try it again. And we get to undefined index limit again at validator 35, and it's actually correct because we're calling the validate method of the parameters validator, passing this thing like this, so just a non-associative array, right? So it's 0 and the value limit, while here we try, so this is what we get, the array that we get, and here we try to read the limit key for the array, which is not set. So what we need to do is to give a name to this parameter we're passing. And I was actually thinking that in Symfony we could actually use YAML or XML files to configure the constraints. So in this case, imagine we have a YAML file that says limit as a key and then all the constraints. Here we could do something probably like for each constraint or for each parameter defined in the YAML, go through it, take the key, take the value from using that key from the parameters coming from the controller, and this is in that YAML file. And so for each one we would run this validation. Now we leave it like this because it's just one. In case we could refactor that to use configuration files, and would be much more readable and even manageable, let's say, easy to manage. So let's run the tests again, and now the limit should have been gone. This is the no root for shout, and it's okay because it's the error we expect to be happening in this test, right? It fails with missing required parameter. So we call shout, we don't pass the author, which is required. It doesn't recognize the root. As I said before, this is not really, we can't silence this error. It's internal to Symfony. And then we have this one, which is this. Here is doing its thing, and actually we have to check why this succeeds, because now it should be working, I guess. We have to look into it. And then we have a bunch of others more. Oh, this might not be that one, right? Quotes endpoint controller test, line 41. It fails with invalid parameters. Alright, we get 200 here. We need to check why. And then we have the errors. Finally, these are the errors we were expecting. The errors on our validator, because we added this max results and we're not passing it in our test. So what we can do is we can create a private max results limit, this is an integer, and then we can create a setup step. So public function setup, we need to say that it returns void, and then we can say that this max results limit equals this boot kernel get container get parameter, and the parameter name, which is our max results limit. And now that we have it defined, we can use this to create our object in all the tests. So let's run it again. And now we're still there. Undefined index limit, this comes from here, and again we're calling validate without the limit key, and the same thing down here, and run again. And finally we have our error for test 41, and line 41 of the controller test, it's again this expected bad request response while getting instead. So let's refactor this response 400, which is HTTP bad request. Yeah, and we might want to use our max result again. So let's do like this, Better to take it from the configuration, right? Because might happen that we change it in configuration, this test will fail. By doing something like this, again the boot kernel, again the get container, again get parameter, and our parameter it's again max result limit, and we want a +1, so it's one more than the maximum, and should fail. It doesn't fail though, so we need to check why. It goes to the controller, passes 11, limit is set, it gets into here, says limit its limit, goes here, creates the assertion, creates the validator, and says validate limit with parameter limit and the constraint, and it doesn't throw the invalid parameter exception. So we need to test this, right? But we have our tests here. So that test, it's actually this one passing from the control. This one it's direct. We call the validator straight away, and we expect an exception, and we actually get an exception, and the test passes. This one, it's the same test, but it passes through the controller instead. So what's the issue with this? So let's see. This is the test, this is the controller. Let's go in the controller and let's print limit and see what we have, because maybe we're not passing this limit. Done, limit, and die. And let's run the failing test again, and our limit is 1, so it doesn't recognize this parameter, right? Array parameters. Okay, so maybe this is not how you pass a parameter, I'm not sure. And I'm back, and as usual, Stackoverflow is your friend. Apparently, this method, it's a bit tricky, because this third parameter, which the definition called parameters, it's actually not the query parameters, but the required parameters for a Symfony route, which would be in our case this one. And I found this in this post on Stackoverflow. The guy has exactly our same problem. He gets his parameters don't pass through, and the solution would be to generate the URL through the router and then passing the URL, appending our parameter to the URL without actually passing the parameters here. So let's do a bit of tests, and for tests I mean let's test it manually. So what we need to generate a, let's call it a URI, and again boot kernel, it's our friend, get container, get router. So this is not the URI, it's the router, and then the URI will be our router get, not get, but generate our route, right? And let's dump it and die, and we get missing parameters. Some mandatory parameters are missing. Alright, so we can't do it like this. We still need to pass author John Doe. So if we run it again, we get our root. So now apparently what we can do, but that's this, right? So probably, can I do it here straight away? Question mark limit equals what? This one. And this one is gonna be empty then. What do we have here? Wrong string concatenation operator, because that's not a string concatenation, that's an actual. So like this now, are we still dying? This one are not needed because I added it straight away here, and it's passing now. It's passing, but still it's not working, right? Because the controller still says 1, doesn't it? Yes. So let's try and do this, and URL, and let's define limit equals to this big thing here. I want to remove it from there, and let's try and put the variable here. And this is what the guy does, right? URL param name equals param value. URL param name equals param value. Yeah, seems so. Ooh, this is nice. Booting the kernel before calling create client. Alright, so we can't do this here, we have to do it after that. And probably for that reason we don't even need to boot the kernel, but we can probably do client get container, if I'm not wrong. Yeah, so we can do that. We can try it again. We still get one. The parameter is still not passing. So maybe I'm doing something wrong when I retrieve that parameter. Let me have a look. So that's me, that's my fault. I did a mistake here. This is not how you do it. Actually, I did it like this because at work we do it like this, but I guess who implemented the Symfony router component into our custom framework made some sort of adapter to make this work, some magic. That's why I don't like magic. So this is not how it works. To access query parameters, you have to do it through the request. We don't need to extend anything and just get our request object here. Request Symfony HTTP Foundation request, and our limit is gonna be request query get limit, and now it should be okay. So we have it now, we have the limit, and now we are doing that. And probably I want to try again at this point to see if those parameters are now correct. So these are the parameters. This one we say limit, which is the parameter name, and the value is gonna be limit. What's wrong with this? Stupid me, I miss a comma here. So now let's see if this parameter works now. Are we still printing the limit? No, we're not, but we know that if it exceeds, it throws an exception. So let's see if we get the exception. And we do. Damn, this was hard and all because stupid error. Okay, so let's run all the tests again to see if we broke anything. 10 tests. Passed with 20 assertions. Nice. This is what I like to see, guys. And now we have our validator, right? And what we're testing, we have a success response from the controller. We have 404 if the required parameter is missing. We have invalid parameters. We get a nice 400. Oh, actually here, let's refactor this. So we get that, we get this. Nice. And so the controller tests everything, and we are testing our validator, which no exception is thrown and exception is thrown. Everything is good. I would say it's working. We can pass to the shouting transformation, or how would you call it? Adapter? Let's see, maybe a string helper. So guys, editing the video I realized that it's already pretty long, so I'm gonna terminate this one here. And I also realized that before implementing the string helper, which will deal with the transformation of our data to produce the output, I went on and refactored the code a bit, and I introduced the Symfony serializer to deal with the data. So this is what the next episode is going to be about. I'll see you there. Bye bye.